नमस्कार, स्वागत है आपका द न्यू लाइसियम फॉर इंग्लिश लिटरेचर पर in the series of literary terms by M.H. Abrams. Today we are going to discuss two terms, first act and scene, and then aestheticism or the aesthetic movement. First I will discuss acts and scenes. What is an act? A drama is divided into acts, and Elizabethan dramas are divided into 5 acts. Elizabethan dramas are divided into 5 acts, and Elizabethan dramatists divided plays into 5 acts on the pattern of the Roman dramatists. They imitated the structure of the Roman plays and divided their plays into 5 acts. It was Horace, the poet critic, who wrote the essay Ars Poetica. He talked that a play must be divided into 5 acts, and Elizabethan dramatists based their plays on that pattern only, right? And acts are divided into smaller scenes. After the Elizabethans in 17th, 18th centuries, the plays were divided on the same pattern. In the 19th centuries, plays inspired by the Russian playwright Anton Chekhov and Norwegian playwright Henrik Ibsen were divided into 4 acts. Right? Russian playwright Anton Chekhov and Norwegian playwright Henrik Ibsen, now they were divided into 4 acts. Right? Anton Chekhov was a Russian playwright and Henrik Ibsen belonged to Norway. Henrik Ibsen belonged to Norway. He is remembered for his play A Doll's House that was appeared in 1875. They divided their plays into 4 acts, and then the dramatists on the pattern of Henrik Ibsen and Anton Chekhov started to divide their plays into 4 acts. In the 20th century, there are several plays divided into 3 acts, right? In the present century, the most common form of structure of the play is of 3 acts. Dramatists like dramatists like George Bernard Shaw, who wrote many plays, plays pleasant, plays unpleasant, right? His plays are divided into 3 acts. And there are also many plays written by George Bernard Shaw and other dramatists, mono act play, single act के plays भी है, right? So this is act. Act is the major division of drama, and then drama में act is divided into scenes. Act को scene में divide किया जाता है. As you remember that Shakespeare divided his plays into acts, and then there are various scenes, right? Various scenes happens. How to make a difference between an act and a scene? How can an audience understand कि now the scene is over and now the act is over? कैसे दिखाया जाता है? When a scene is over, generally the light is dimmed. The light is dimmed, or at some instances the curtain falls. But when an act ends, the curtain falls, and then there is a break. There is an intermission. Right, just I show you here a picture of the front part of a theater. This is the front part of a theater, and here you see a theater is made, and this is the place where the play is being acted, and now here is a curtain. This curtain falls at the end of the play, or these lights are dimmed at the end of the scene, and this curtain where the place, this arch where the curtain is hanging, it is known as proscenium arch. It is known as proscenium arch that frames the front of the stage. The end of a scene is usually indicated by the dropped curtain or dimming of the lights, and the end of an act by a dropped curtain and an intermission. Intermission होता है, और intermission के साथ people come to know that now the act has ended, now other act is to start. So this was all about act and seen according to M.H. Abrams. Alright, now I come to the second term that is to be discussed today, and that term is aestheticism. That term is aesthetic movement, right? And the headquarter of the aesthetic movement was in Paris, was in France, right? Aestheticism or aesthetic movement was a European phenomenon during the later 19th century, right? During the later 19th century, it was a European phenomenon headquartered in France, headquartered in Paris, right? In 19th century, right, 19th century was the century of industrialization, was the century of class division, right? Class division between bourgeois and proletariat, between the capitalist and the proletariat, the labor class. So this development of science and class struggle was on its peak, and in opposition to the dominance of this scientific thinking and in defiance of the widespread indifference or hostility on the middle class society of their time to any art, right, that was not useful, did not teach moral value. ये एक प्रिंसिपल था कि वो लिटरेचर जो मोरल वैल्यू नहीं सिखाता है वो आर्ट बिल्कुल भी यूजफुल नहीं है. Art means to teach something, to teach morality. This was the popular belief among the middle class people of the 19th century. Right? The purpose of literature was to teach something. The purpose of art was to teach something. This was the basic phenomenon. This was the major idea between among the middle class people. And such arts, those arts which do not teach anything, they were not supposed to be useful, so they were totally rejected, right? And then aestheticism comes. Aestheticism comes against such opinions, against such ideas. Aestheticism propagates, it advocates that literature has its own beauty. Literature has its own beauty, and whosoever reads a piece of literature should focus on literature only. It has supreme value, right? It is not concerned with external beauty in external things, but it concerns with the things that are on the page only. This is aestheticism. Aestheticism means beauty of literature, and from this point a phrase comes into literature, that is art for art's sake. Art is made for art, it is not made for propagation, it is not made for propaganda, but art is made to spread the beauty that is inside. This is aestheticism, right? In opposition to the dominance of scientific thinking and in defiance of the widespread indifference or hostility of the middle class society of their time to any art that was not useful or did not teach moral values, right? जो आर्ट जो moral values नहीं सिखाते थे वो बिल्कुल भी यूजफुल नहीं समझे जाते थे, और जो यूजफुल ना हो उन्हें क्यों पढ़े. उस टाइम पर French writers developed the view that a work of art is the supreme value. A work of art is the supreme value among human products, precisely because it is self-sufficient and has no use or moral aim outside its own being. It is self-sufficient. You don't go anywhere to comprehend the meaning. It is limited, and the supreme value lies in art, and art is the greatest product of humankind. During the Victorian era, during the industrial era, everything was considered in the text, in the context of production, selling and buying. That was the trade language, and literature was also thought to be a product, but literature was such a product that the best that contained the supreme value among all human products, precisely because it is self-sufficient and has no use or moral aim. It doesn't have any moral aim. It is not the duty of a literary man, it is not the duty of literature to teach morality, इसका जो पर्पस होता है वो क्या होता है? दैट इज समथिंग डिफरेंट, दैट इज समथिंग एल्स। ऑलराइट, दैट इज कॉल्ड एस्थेटिसिज्म। Arts for art's sake. What do you mean by arts for art's sake? A rallying crying of aestheticism became the phrase I art, poor I art. I art, poor I art. This is the phrase. I art, poor I art. It means art for art's sake. Art is for art. Art is not for morality. Art is not for value. Art is not for propaganda. Art is not a piece of party, but it is art for art's sake. You have to be inside. It doesn't need anything from outside. That is art for art's sake. The end of a work of art is simply to exist in its formal perfection. That is to be beautiful and to be contemplated as an end in itself. Art is beautiful, it contains supreme value, and it is self-sufficient. It is art for art's sake, right? Nothing is required from outside world, right? This was the popular belief. This is the belief of aestheticism. And how aestheticism came into being? It was not a new phenomenon. In fact, if you talk about the historical roots, M.H. Abrams talks about the historical roots of aestheticism. और वो जो है रूट कहाँ पर है? M.H. Abrams finds this root of aestheticism in Immanuel Kant's work, The Critique of Judgment. The Critique of Judgment was a text, was a book written by the German philosopher Immanuel Kant. और उस जर्मन फिलोसोफर इमैनुअल कांट ने बात की थी, किसकी? इमैनुअल कांट ने इन हिज क्रिटिक ऑफ जजमेंट में बात की थी, द प्योर एस्थेटिक एक्सपीरियंस कंसिस्ट्स ऑफ अ डिसइंटरेस्टेड कंटेम्पलेशन ऑफ एन ऑब्जेक्ट दैट प्लीजेस फॉर इट्स ओन सेक. राइट, disinterestedness. Disinterested means to be totally neutral. Don't be biased, right? Don't be prejudiced. That is disinterestedness. And pure aesthetic experience consists of a disinterested contemplation, right? Disinterested contemplation means thought, meditation, right, of an object that pleases for its own sake without reference to reality or to the external ends of utility or morality, right? Literature doesn't go to the external world. There is no need of any reality. There is no reality. There is no need of external things, no to the external ends of utility. There is no need of outside morality. As a self-conscious movement, however, French aestheticism is often said to date from Théophile Gautier's witty defense of his assertion that art is useless. And this he wrote in the preface to one of his novels, that art is useless. This is the comment of the French novelist, French poet Théophile Gautier. तो फ्रांस का जो रूट है वो यहां से आता है. होल एस्थेटिसिज्म जो है it starts in the 18th century itself, when in 1790 Immanuel Kant's work The Critique of Judgment was published, right? The view of French aestheticism were introduced into the Victorian England by Walter Pater. Walter Pater was one of the aesthetic philosophers, right? One of the theorists जो है Walter Pater थे, and he brought the French aestheticism to England, right, with his emphasis on high artifice and stylistic subtlety. His recommendation to crowd one's life with exquisite sensations. Exquisite sensations are required, and his advocacy of the supreme value of beauty and the love of art for its own sake, just love art for its own sake, thinking that it is art, nothing else. This was the view of Walter Pater. Walter Pater wrote a book, right, and the name of the book was Conclusions to Studies in the History of Renaissance. Right, in the history of Renaissance, what does he write? He concludes with the famous invitation to burn with a hard gem-like flame in the desire for beauty, the love of art for its own sake. Right, क्या करना है आपको? Desire for beauty and love of art for its own sake. और इसके लिए इनवाइट किया उन्होंने, किस लिए? To burn with a hard gem-like flame. To burn with a hard gem-like flame in the desire for beauty, the love of art for its own sake, and the artistic and moral views of aestheticism were also expressed by many Irish and English authors. Right? एक poet था A.C. Swinburne. He wrote a collection of poems and ballads, and in poems and ballads you can find the views of aestheticism. He didn't write for the sake of society, but he wrote for the sake of poetry, he wrote for the sake of poem, he wrote for the sake of art, that is art for art's sake. Right? And apart from A.C. Swinburne, Oscar Wilde, Arthur Simmons, Lionel Johnson, as well as the artists like J.M. Whistler and Aubrey Beardsley. And one of the greatest aesthetician was Oscar Wilde. Oscar Wilde, he was an Irish, and he wrote many works, and he advocated the art for art's sake. The best known advocate of aestheticism was Oscar Wilde, right? Who at the end of his life lamented in his book, क्या lament है? I treated art as supreme reality. I treated art as the supreme reality and life as a mere mode of fiction. What is life? Life is a mode of fiction. And what is art? Art is the supreme reality. This is aestheticism. This is the climax of aestheticism, and the climax of aestheticism came from the pen of Oscar Wilde, and Mr. M.H. Abrams didn't mention this quotation of Oscar Wilde in his definition of aestheticism. I have added this quotation from somewhere else. Right? M.H. Abrams talks about aestheticism, he talks about Immanuel Kant, he talks about the French philosophers, he talks about Walter Pater, and he talks about art for arts movement. Right? और एक पॉइंट बीच का मिस हो गया है, एक पॉइंट बीच का मिस हो गया है, एक पर अभी और आगे आते हैं। वो बीच का मिसिंग पॉइंट क्या है कि जो जर्मन जो फ्रेंच थे वो कहां से इंस्पायर्ड थे? वो थे एडगर एलन पो से। एडगर एलन पो had written a book, right? Had written a book, and what was the name of Edgar Allan Poe's book? जहां से ये लोग इंस्पायर थे, जहां से इनको मिला हुआ था आज है कंटेंट लिखने के लिए एस्थेटिसिज्म को। एडगर एलन पो का अपने क्लास में मैंने एक दिन जिक्र भी किया था, उनके एक एसे का भी हमने जिक्र किया था, और उस एसे का नाम था द पोइटिक प्रिंसिपल। क्या नाम था? द पोइटिक प्रिंसिपल नाम था उस एसे का। एडगर एलन पो का था ये एसे। राइट? एडगर एलन पो का ऐसे था द पोइटिक प्रिंसिपल, एंड फ्रेंच एस्थेटिक्स जो थे खासकर उसमें से बॉडलियर, he was very much inspired from Edgar Allan Poe's essay The Poetic Principle। और एडगर एलन पो ने क्या कहा था कि द सुप्रीम आर्ट जो है, द सुप्रीम वर्क इज पोयम पर से। द सुप्रीम वर्क इज पोयम पर से, और पोयम पर से का मतलब है अ पोयम रिटन सोलिली फॉर द पोयम्स सेक। राइट? पोयम रिटन सोलिली, सोलिली माने ओनली, फॉर द पोएम्स सेक, इससे इंस्पायर थे बॉडलियर द फ्रेंच फिलोसोफर, राइट, द फ्रेंच एस्थेटिशियन वो थे, वो इससे इंस्पायर हैं और इसी से मूवमेंट आगे की तरफ प्रोसीड करता है, राइट। एंड आफ्टर द ऑस्कर वाइल्ड, हाँ, किसको इसने इन्फ्लुएंस किया है? It influenced a major critical theory that is called formalism, that is known by the name of New Criticism. It said, aestheticism said that art for art's sake, you don't have to go outside the text to get the pleasure, to get the beauty of the text. And this is the essential view of the new criticism, right? It talks, aestheticism talks about the autonomy of the text, right? It talks about the autonomy of the text, especially the view of autonomy. Autonomy means self-sufficiency of a work of art, the emphasis on craft and artistry, and the concept of poem or novel as an end in itself and as invested with intrinsic values has been important in the writings of prominent 20th century authors like W.B. Yeats, T. Hume, T.S. Eliot, as well as in the literary theory of the New Criticism. Literary theory of New Criticism also talks about autotelic texts. Texts are autotelic. You don't have to go around the world to fetch the meaning, but meaning lies inside the text. And this was one of the prophecies, one of the principles advocated by aesthetic movement, advocated by aestheticism. All right, कोई क्वेश्चन हो तो कमेंट बॉक्स ओपन रहेगा आपके लिए, वहां जरूर शेयर करिएगा. एक्ट, सीन, aestheticism and aesthetic movement. I hope you would have understood all these 4 words in today's lecture. I'll be waiting for your comments. Thank you so much. मिलते हैं next class में with a few more charms. Good luck.